Morning. Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources will come to order. Subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on HR 6654, the Climate Adaptation Science Centers Act. Introduce my friend and colleague and our full committee chair, Raul Grijalva. Thank you, Chair Grijalva, for joining us today. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chair and the ranking minority member or their designees. Good to see you, the ranking member. Welcome, Mr. Stauber, Representative Stauber.
Likewise.
They will allow us to hear from our witnesses sooner and will help members keep to their schedule. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they're submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or at the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. Without objection, the member from Hawaii, Representative Case, is authorized to question the witnesses in today's hearing. As described in the notice, statements, documents, or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository at hnrcdocs@mail.house.gov. Additionally, please note that as with in-person meetings, members are responsible for their own microphones. Members can be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. Finally, members or witnesses experiencing technical problems should inform the committee staff immediately, if not sooner. With that, I'm going to begin with my opening statement. During my time as chair of this subcommittee, addressing the root causes of climate change has been a top priority. Reducing carbon pollution is the single most important action we can take to stave off the worst effects of climate change for future generations. I believe we must be doing more to reduce emissions from oil, gas, and coal on public lands, and we must be quickly ramping up the use of renewable energy. But it's also an avoidable reality that we're already dealing with, the harmful impacts of climate change at this very moment. The threats of fires, of floods, of droughts, of hurricanes, and sea level rise are top of the mind for millions of Americans. In 2021, we endured 20 weather and climate-related disasters that caused more than $1 billion in damages. These events also led to the deaths of 688 people. But in the face of this tragedy and destruction, our communities remain resilient, and after they recover from the immediate damage, they are left questioning how to rebuild so that the next storm doesn't have a similar impact. We need to ensure that communities are equipped with the best and latest climate adaptation science and management practices as they face these difficult decisions. That's where the Climate Adaptation Science Centers, or CASCs, come in. The CASCs have supported communities in making climate adaptation decisions since 2008, when Chairman Grijalva championed efforts to create and to fund a National Center for Climate Change Research at the U.S. Geological Survey. The CASCs are a unique climate science program. The National Climate Adaptation Science Center, based at the USGS's headquarters, coordinates the program and conducts science on national priorities. Each of the 9 Regional centers is hosted at a university within a specified region and has multiple consortium institution members, such as universities, nonprofits, and independent research organizations. The regional centers partner directly with the communities they serve, coordinating with stakeholders like land managers, tribes, and state and federal agencies to answer specific climate adaptation questions. For example, in my home state of California, the Southwest Task is working on new localized projections for sea level rise to help land managers prepare for the impacts on coastal habitat, on recreation, and on the economy. They're working on one study assessing southwestern forests' vulnerability to climate change and wildfire, and another looking into how to incorporate indigenous knowledge and cultural burning practices into forest management. They're looking at the impact of drought on waterbirds and wetland habitat in the California Central Valley, and are improving forecasting of water availability from recent snow droughts across the Southwest. These are just a few examples of the work done by CASCs. Since their inception, the CASCs have completed more than 400 projects nationwide and have over 300 more currently underway. Chair Grijalva's legislation, H.R. 6654, permanently authorizes the Climate Adaptation Science Centers into law, ensuring that their vital work can continue for years to come. And I'm proud to be an original co-sponsor of Chair Grijalva's bill. I look forward to hearing testimony from USGS and other key program stakeholders and to having a productive discussion of this legislation. With that, I recognize Ranking Member Stauber for his opening comments.
Well, thank you very much.
Welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair Lowenthal. And we're here today to discuss HR 6654, the Climate Adaptation Science Center Act, or CAS Act, sponsored by our committee chairman, Grijalva. HR 6655 explodes the authorization for an existing program called the Climate Adaptation Science Centers, CASCs, at the U.S. Geological Survey. The CASC program consists of one national center and 9 regional centers intended to research environment and climate-related issues to help land management decisions. And I'm pleased to share that the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, is the regional hub for the CASC Midwest and has done great work on a host of topics, including sport fish restoration, wild rice, and moose habitat. We need to study these topics. Our way of life in northern Minnesota and across the country is impacted by our natural environment, and the more we know, the better we do. However, CASC seems to fund some real head scratchers as well, which really don't appear to benefit state and local resource managers as the program is intended. For example, USGS is currently studying projects in places like Madagascar, China, and Laos with American taxpayer dollars. How does that help tribal officials in Southern California handle drought or invasive species? How does this help us better understand what emerald ash borer is doing to our forests in northern Minnesota? And this legislation in front of us, unfortunately, only will make the program's shortcomings worse without improving the program's strengths. The CASC Act we're considering today ill-defines research activities, duplicates work across the federal government, and amounts to a jaw-dropping 251% increase in spending annually. First of all, the research activities allowed under this bill are vague and broad. The term, quote, cultural resources, end quote, for example, is so imprecise that almost anything can be studied by this program at any time. This seems to be in contrast with the narrow task CASCs should be focused on, helping land managers make state and local decisions. Similarly, there seems to be significant overlap between this program and others across the federal government. So let's go back to the Madagascar example. Why is CASC doing that work? Don't we have a failed presidential candidate turned, quote, climate envoy that circles the globe in a taxpayer-funded private jet solving climate change abroad for us? With all seriousness, the National Science Foundation and other USGS programs, such as the Cooperative Research Units, CRUs, let alone the State Department, are better suited to certain topics and are appropriated funds annually to carry out this research. What CASC needs is a standardized approach to direct research. Now, regional centers get feedback from stakeholders on project proposals, but ultimately, the director of the regional center chooses based on their own opinion of the topic's importance. We need to make sure we're funding intentional academic research that benefits our communities, not funding academia for the sake of churning out a high rate of PhDs, and let alone the authorization level. In fiscal year 2021, this program was funded at about $41 million per year, a very reasonable level. The legislation we are considering today explodes that authorization to $145 million when it's all said and done. And just to clarify, that is not even the total. That figure is a cool $605 million over the next 5 years. This huge increase in taxpayer dollars comes with no controls for overhead or administrative costs. And this seems to be a recurring theme with this majority. Supercharge or reauthorize programs and then let the details figure themselves out. Meanwhile, unchecked government spending this year has depressed our economy and supercharged our inflation. America can't afford this type of spending, especially when families can't afford energy, food, or gasoline. That being said, I acknowledge the need for the funding scientific research. CASCs are doing great work in my region and across this country. So let's keep our research focused, intentional, and accountable. And I look forward to working with my colleagues across the aisle on this bill to achieve a productive, efficient tool for regional land use planning. I thank the witnesses for being here today, and Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member. I now recognize Full Committee Chair Raul Grijalva for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Chair Lowenthal, for holding the hearing today. Very much appreciated, and thank all our witnesses and the Ranking Member. I'm going to file my statement for the record, but just one point to make, and I certainly appreciate as we move forward with the legislation, appreciate that the needed opportunity, Mr. Chair Lowenthal and Ranking Member, to work with you to make the legislation stronger and more effective, and to address some gaps or some omissions that people might recognize. But the intent is essential. The issue of permanency, the issue of climate change, and the underlying issue in climate change of equity is not something that is going to go away. Its urgency is even more upon us. So the issue of permanency has to do with the reality that this issue of mitigating the climate crisis is going to take more than a 4-year, 5-year authorization. This is a permanent commitment that the federal government needs to make to provide communities with the adaptation strategies, techniques, best practices, and to use the science and the empirical information available to drive those adaptations. It becomes more inclusive with this legislation. It becomes permanent, and it's funded to levels to match the reality of the crisis. And so I appreciate it, the hearing, Mr. Chairman Lowenthal, and I look forward to the witnesses, and thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Chairman Grijalva. We're now going to move to our first panel, and I'm happy to welcome our first witness, Dr. Doug Beard, Chief of the National Climate Adaptation Science Center. Dr. Beard, welcome to the committee. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Chairman Lowenthal and Ranking Member Stauber and members of the subcommittee for an opportunity to appear before you today on behalf of the U.S. Geological Survey and to testify on the Climate Adaptation Science Centers Act, the CAS Act. My name is Doug Beard, and I serve as the Chief of the U.S. Geological Survey's National Climate Adaptation Science Center, a position I have held since 2009. In this capacity, I've been asked to discuss the official establishment of the National and Regional Climate Adaptation Science Centers. I'm pleased that Congress and Natural Resources Committee maintain their interest in and support for our work and appreciate your consideration of this important topic. In 2008, recognizing the pressing need to better understand the effects of climate change on the nation's natural resources, Congress directed the USGS to establish a center to understand the impacts of global warming on wildlife. In response to the congressional directive, USGS initiated a stakeholder-driven process to identify how best to access the scientific capabilities needed to help fish and wildlife managers adapt to a changing climate. The outcome of that process suggested a structure that co-located federal employees with university staff to access the best scientists needed to address the questions regardless of its source. Between 2010 and 2012, the USGS established 8 Department of Interior regional climate science centers across the United States. In 2018, Congress renamed the CSCs, the Climate Science Centers, as the Climate Adaptation Science Centers. And in fiscal year 2020, in response to congressional direction, the USGS established a 9th regional CASC in the Midwest. The national and regional CAS, together known as the CAS Network, cover the entire continental United States, Alaska, Hawaii, U.S.-affiliated Pacific Islands, and the U.S. Caribbean. Today, the national and regional CAS conduct research to provide research managers, indigenous communities, and other partners with scientific information and decision-making tools they need to understand and adapt to the effects of climate change on fish, wildlife, water, lands, and people. The CAS work closely with national and regional partners to identify the highest priority science needs and execute projects that will inform various science and adaptation management questions in their respective regions. The National CAS, based at USGS headquarters in Reston, Virginia, serves as the national office for the CAS network. The National CAS provides leadership and guidance on administration, partnerships, information management, and communications. The 9 regional CAS focus on delivering science that addresses resource management priorities for federal, state, and tribal agencies within their footprint. The CAS network has been very productive since its inception, producing science to support on-the-ground management needs, training the next generation of natural resource managers and scientists, and providing data and tools to be used in adaptation planning. For example, in 2021, the CAS network provided more than $41 million in program funding. 40 new projects were selected just this year, each tied to a stakeholder-identified need across the nation. The CAS supported 160 students and fellows through our fellowship and training programs, and we work directly with multiple tribal nations to identify their climate science needs. Our scientists produced more than 100 data sets and tools and published more than 170 articles this past fiscal year. We support the intent of the Climate Adaptation Science Centers Act, which will ensure that the science produced by the CAS network remains a key source for natural and cultural resource planning and management. The USGS believes this bill will provide the necessary authorities to help strengthen and continue to build the Climate Adaptation Science Centers so they can more effectively provide scientific expertise to respond to the effects of extreme weather events and climate trends. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today. I'll be very happy to answer any questions you might have.
Well, I thank you, Dr. Beard. I want to remind members that Committee Rule 3D imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. The chair will now recognize members for any questions they may wish to ask our first panel. And I'm going to recognize myself for 5 minutes. Dr. Beard, thank you for your testimony and thank you for joining us today. Last year, Dr. Beard, the president's budget proposed to double annual funding for the CASCs. While we're awaiting the fiscal year 2023 presidential budget and the presidential budget request, do you anticipate that the demand for work produced by CASCs will continue to grow in the coming years?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman, for that question. Yes, we do believe it will continue to grow, and evidence suggests from our current processes that we're only able to fund around 50% of the really high quality scientific proposals we receive. So we clearly have more that we could do if we had extra funding. We also have seen an increase in demand for scientists to provide expertise in the use of climate information and model outputs. And so we do the best we can to respond to those demands, to basically explain to people how to use climate model data, what does it mean, where do you get it, how do you incorporate it in your land management decisions. And we are barely scratching the surface of that demand with the limited amount of resources we have.
So I want to follow up on that just specifically, and it doesn't have to be a long answer from you, on the benefits, if you believe, of increased funding for CASCs. Where specifically do you see right now that we would expand your work and the work of CASCs?
Yeah, thanks again for that question. So indeed, we think that there are some very specific topics around federal, state level adaptation planning in terms of creating what we would term more resilient landscapes, especially from things like wildfire, drought, the effects of invasive species, the things that we all see today that are really affecting our resources. We also think we can expand and get more engagement with traditionally underserved communities, such as our tribal nations. We do the best we can with tribal governments and the Pacific Island natives, but indeed we see a lot of demand from those areas.
Dr. Beard, I think members of the committee would be very interested in learning how the national CASC works with the regional centers to determine research priorities.
Yeah, thanks. So it's fairly clear at the National Center, we generally just set broad overall guidance on direction, but the regional priorities are set by our regional directors working with their stakeholder or partners. They identify topics of concern in the area, and then they work to fund those projects as best they can, directly working with regional partners. The National Center just provides the broad overall direction to that process.
Thank you. And I think what the committee would be helpful for members of the committee to understand more. We all understand that climate change impacts nearly every aspect of our lives, but I think specifically we'd like to know more. How does the work of CASCs help protect local economies?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So, we think and we hope by working with state and tribal managers directly, first of all, we provide expertise to local units of government to enact climate change adaptation measures. So we're really trying to help prevent the worst impacts, be it from changes in air quality driven by fires or flooding caused by extreme storms. And if we could do the best to anticipate those and prevent those, it certainly makes the recovery from those impacts much greater. So we've been working, for example, up in Lake Ontario, had some severe flooding in 2017 and 2019, and we're trying to actually work with local communities to enact local shoreline protections so that they can perhaps forgo the worst of those impacts to their local communities.
Well, thank you. I now recognize the ranking member, my good friend Ranking Member Stauber for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Chair Lowenthal. And thank you, Dr. Beard, for your testimony. And as I mentioned in my statement, the Climate Adaptation Science Centers are a helpful resource in my district and nationwide. So thank you for your public service. However, I noticed that the National CASC has funded research projects in places like Madagascar, Thailand, and Vietnam. How do these projects benefit state and local managers?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Congressman. Indeed, actually, I'll just talk specifically about the work in Madagascar, and actually in all these cases. This is actually, we don't fund these generally. These are requests that are done on behalf of, I think in the Madagascar case, it's Department of Interior's International Technical Assistance Program. They approached us to provide some expertise to local climate adaptation planning in Madagascar. And so the funding was actually, I can't 100% remember, but I do believe it was a USAID funding that actually did that. We have to pay our salaries, so indeed part of that, part of it funding does go for our salaries. And the work in Southeast Asia, again, was also with DOI ITAP programs. Although there may have been one other that we've done on behalf of the embassy requests. We often get requests from the embassies for our expertise to help in those areas. So again, we do pay our salaries for those, but most of the funding for the work is provided by other parts of the government.
So would you be able, Dr. Beard, would you be able to give this committee a breakdown of the U.S. taxpayer money that's has been dedicated to, you know, shall we say, foreign research, if you would? That would be great to get down to the bottom of it. I mean, as you know, the funding in this request it increases almost 251% of American taxpayer monies. And so do you think that this increase is going to continue?
The increase in requests from local governments, state governments?
And the funding. Do you think the funding, you'll be requesting more funding? Do you think it's going to increase with the requests coming, for instance, from overseas in those areas?
Oh, well, our request, at least in the 22 budget, was based off of a number of items that we put in for domestic support. So it was specifically in terms of extending this notion of climate adaptation services, some more science, some more travel support. There wasn't anything specific to overseas work. Thank
okay.
you.
And then again, the overhead cost of the program, it's really been hard to determine, as you even mentioned right now, you know, the precise cost. Are you able to give us a breakdown of overhead and administrative cost at both the national level and our regional centers? Do you have that?
Yeah, yes, we do. We remember that most of this money that we spend goes out the door to existing resources. We will get you the exact number, but our overhead is somewhere between 15 and 20% to operate from the federal side to operate this program.
Okay. And the regional centers would be 75 to 80?
Well, but most of the funding goes then out to regional centers to do science. So yeah, it's around 75 to 80. And then, but we pay staff out there, but largely
right.
It's largely small amount.
Do you have an idea of the CASC regional centers, what the staff cost would be?
I do, and it varies by center because we have various staffing levels at various centers. Off the top of my head, it's probably 10%, but I'll need to get real figures back to you to verify that.
Perfect. That would be great. And again, I appreciate what you do and to have the Midwest CASC located in our great state of Minnesota at the Twin Cities campus have done really, really good work. So thank you, Dr. Beard. I appreciate your service. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you, Ranking Member. And thank you for the tone. I think there are differences that people feel about the scope but I think in general, we all like the work of the Adaptation Science Center. So I think that we should remember that. We're now talking about how do we shape something that all of us agree to is or so far agree to is very important. And with that, I recognize the champion of the Climate Adaptation Science Centers, Chairman Grijalva, the 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, and let me associate myself with those comments that you just made, Mr. Chairman, that, as we move forward, certainly the opportunity and to examine something that's doable when all of us agree on it is certainly something I look forward to working with you and looking forward to your work on that, Mr. Lowenthal. Thank you for that. Dr. Beard, one question that came up in the ranking member's opening comments and point of clarification or provide an example in which, the center's work to protect cultural resources from the consequences of climate change. Is there an example that you can point to? I'm assuming that fits the criteria that the centers follow.
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. Yes, indeed. I'll talk specifically about an example that we did with the National Park Service in conjunction with the Cape Lookout National Seashore. And they're charged with protecting the park's two historic villages, Portsmouth and Cape Lookout, and its iconic mid-19th century lighthouse in the face of sea level rise and other climate-driven events. So we've been working specifically with the park to provide park managers a model and a decision process to make long-term plans to protect these historic resources from demanding coastal conditions in a changing climate, doing that under their limited budget. So and we're learning from this process, and we hope we can make this available for other sorts of seaside historical places to be used.
Yeah, and I think the regional concept is something that I think needs to be, as you said, it's been key to this whole process, and that sea level rise in a region is of critical importance, and much of the attention and research. The reaction to the drought in the arid part of the world where I live and where one of the centers is, the adaptation and the science involved in that. So I think it's been a strength, and because each community and each set of stakeholders, I think, brings, as I've seen here, a unique set of perspectives and experiences and urgencies that might not be the same as the region in New England. You see what I mean? And I think that work has been understated, how important that diversification of attention to climate and to the various, there is no silver bullet and there is not one size fits all adaptation strategies that you're working on. And that requires that I think the regional and that local jurisdictions and state jurisdictions and tribes be part of it. And I think anything to continue to move it in that direction is good. So thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Chair Grijalva. I now recognize my friend and colleague from Louisiana, Representative Grace, for 5 minutes of questions.
Hey, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank Dr. Beard for being with us today. Question I'm curious about, and I know that Ranking Member Stauber asked you a little bit about the project funding. Can you talk a little bit about the methodology that y'all go through and how you prioritize projects?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. Certainly. So on an annual basis, we convene a local partners group in each region, and they identify what appears to be the highest priority science needs in that region related to climate. And then we go through a process, usually a request for proposals process, a competitive process where we solicit projects from the universities that are in the region, part of the consortium and other and USGS people. And then we have a technical review panel essentially grade these proposals and provide us what they think are the highest level proposals, the ones that best fit the criteria that we put out in the request for proposals. So we do this on an annual basis. We're really trying to hit the concerns of the local regional constituencies to provide science for their needs.
That if that were to come to fruition, that you would see kind of that same process used, but just scaled up significantly?
Yes, that's correct. I mean, this has been the process we put in almost from day one. I mean, when we started these, we really wanted them to react to the on-the-ground issues in that region, and so we'd scale it up. We'd probably have bigger technical review panels, probably maybe be able to add a few more partners to our science panels. But that's essentially the process we would use going forward.
And how is the fund distributed between the national and the regional centers now, and how would that change?
Right now, the national center is mainly administrative, and we keep about out of the 41 million, about 36 million went out to regional centers and 4 million stayed in headquarters for administration.
Okay.
We can get you those exact numbers, but that's just about where it was.
Okay. And so, just yesterday we marked up a number of bills authorizing hundreds of millions of dollars for various programs. We've crossed $30 trillion in debt. I've got 3 kids and represent hundreds of thousands of others, and I'm really concerned about that. If you had to just explain to an average taxpayer how this has been a good investment historically and why you think a significant increase in investment is in taxpayers' interest, what would you say?
Yeah, thanks again. I think it's honestly, I think it's just part of smart planning. It's what we're trying to do here is help reduce vulnerability to things like these extreme events we see, whether it's flash flooding or wildfires. And we know the science tells us that if we can prevent the worst of these impacts, or we can anticipate them even better, it's actually cheaper than when we have to do full-scale cost recovery. And so essentially, I like to think of it like your retirement portfolio. In some respects, you're planning for the future and trying to offgo the worst impacts and costs that may hit you in the future. And so that's, I think, the benefit we add.
Wait, we're supposed to plan for retirement? Hold on.
Oh yeah.
So we can develop all of these tools within government. We can come up with recommendations. I'll tell you, one of the frustrations I have is the United States has led the world in emissions reduction, but for every 1 ton of emissions we've reduced, China's increased by 4. And so we're not seeing that global trend, which is very frustrating to me. But putting that aside for just a minute, can you just maybe translate some of the products that y'all have developed and how it has turned into action on the ground in terms of, making proactive adaptation or resiliency investments or decisions?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah, and so one of the things, and I could talk a little bit about a project we have down in your region, which is working with resilient coastal shellfish populations. And what we're doing is working with the local governments down there and LSU to basically help them to maintain and develop sustainable populations of oysters and other shellfish and support the future production and success. So we know that sea level rise and change in temperatures will impact these animals, and we're trying to put that in the hands of the people on the ground so they can maintain this business going forward.
Great. Thank you. Mr. Chair, I know we're over time, but I wanted to remind you, when you came down and we visited down here in Louisiana, I showed you some of those oyster reefs, how we've designed them in a way to break a wave action. So you get oyster production, you're getting cleaner water, you're getting carbon sequestration, and being able to do wave attenuation. So pretty cool stuff down here. So thank you, Mr.
It was cool. Thank you. And I thank Representative Graves for his questions, and I now call upon my dear friend, Representative Huffman, for 5 minutes of questions. Welcome. I lose Representative Huffman. Calling on Representative Huffman once, twice. Well, not seeing unless someone can tell me, not seeing Representative Huffman now. I'm going to thank Dr. Beard for your time. And I'm going to introduce our second, and you're excused. You want to listen? That's great. But you're excused. If you go, if you wish, Dr. Beard. So now I'm going to introduce our second panel of witnesses. First, Dr. Renee Mcpherson is the University Director for the South Central Climate Adaptation Science Center and Associate Professor of Geography and Environmental Sustainability at the University of Oklahoma. I'm going to introduce all the witnesses first before we ask any questions or ask them to speak. Dr. Doug Austin is the Executive Director of the American Fisheries Society. Mr. Chris Caldwell is the President of the College of Menominee Nation. And Mr. Scott Cameron is a Senior Advisor at Cornea Incorporated. Let me remind the witnesses that under our committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but that their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. Let me remind them also that when you begin, the timer will begin. It will turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining. I recommend that members and witnesses joining remotely use the stage view so they may pin the timer on their screen. After your testimony is complete, please remember to mute yourself to avoid any inadvertent background noise. I will allow the entire panel to testify before questioning any of the witnesses. And I'm going to begin and recognize Dr. Mcpherson for 5 minutes of testimony. Welcome to the subcommittee, Dr. Mcpherson.
Thank you, and good afternoon, Chairman Lowenthal, Ranking Member Stauber, Chairman Grijalva, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Renee Mcpherson, and I'm an atmospheric scientist and professor at the University of Oklahoma. I'm here to support the Climate Adaptation Science Centers Act on behalf of the university directors of the Regional Climate Adaptation Science Centers, or CASCs. I'm the university director of the South Central CASC. Climate disasters endanger the ability of important ecosystems, provide us with food, clean air and water, economic products, and natural beauty. In the 1980s, there were only $29 billion weather and climate disasters. In the 2010s, there were 123. Last year, wildfires burned iconic forests of the American West, destroyed habitats, and spewed toxic chemicals. Along the Gulf Coast, Hurricane Ida devastated tribal communities, polluted water supplies, and killed hundreds of millions of fish. Other climate hazards happen more gradually. For example, sea levels in the Hawaiian Islands threaten coastal infrastructure, native Hawaiian fish ponds, and a tourism economy worth over $17 billion. This is where the CASCs have a critical role to play. We deliver actionable science to natural and cultural resource managers regarding what climate impacts to expect, what systems are vulnerable, and how and where ecosystem resilience can be enhanced using traditional knowledge, climate-smart management, climate-informed conservation, and other approaches. Most importantly, the casks are partnership driven. Our science products are directly actionable because we work with managers in the Department of the Interior, state and local agencies, tribes, indigenous peoples, and nonprofits to address the needs they identify. Given the tools to help ecosystems adapt, resource managers can preserve our wilderness areas and wildlife refuges, protect our water supplies and native habitats, and support sustainable hunting, fishing, and outdoor experiences. They can also save money, minimize litigation, and enhance economic development through regional approaches to hazard reduction. But we are struggling to meet managers' needs as climate-related challenges unfold with increasing speed and impact. One tangible step to serve these managers is to stabilize our centers by passing the CASC Act, which codifies the national and regional climate adaptation science centers within the USGS. As background, the USGS National CASC manages 9 regional CASCs that serve every state, territory, and the U.S. affiliated Pacific Islands. Research universities host the 9 regional CASCs as cooperative partnerships between the USGS and a consortium of research institutions, tribes and tribal colleges, state and local entities, and non-governmental organizations. Collaboration with our universities benefits the USGS because we can respond quickly to emerging issues. We link the USGS with well-established networks of regional partners and scholars who can address complex, multidisciplinary problems. We educate a next-generation workforce to prepare for and respond to climate impacts on fish, wildlife, ecosystems, and the communities they support. The CASC Act stabilizes our network by ensuring that we can sustain durable relationships of trust with our partners and direct our work to address local, state, regional, and national needs at priorities on timescales that cross multiple administrations. The CASC Act will solidify how the USGS works with our regional consortia to serve these needs. The CASC Act fosters USGS partnerships with other federal agencies to encourage a collaborative approach to climate adaptation. The Act provides clear fiscal mechanisms for the USGS to transfer funds to partners, eliminating administrative delays that stall climate adaptation projects. The Act restores the role of an advisory council to the National CASC to ensure the agency is forward-looking, strategic, and informed by important perspectives. By formalizing and building on the existing program, the CASC Act will improve the consistency, continuity, and efficiency of the CASC network for the long term. I thank the committee for your consideration of this bill.
Thank you, Dr. McPherson. The chair will now recognize Dr. Austin for 5 minutes of testimony. Welcome to the committee, Dr. Austin.
Thank you very much. Thank you and good afternoon, Subcommittee Chair Lowenthal, Committee Chair Grijalva, Ranking Member Stauber, and members of the committee. It's a pleasure to be with you today. As was stated, my name is Doug Austin, and I'm Executive Director of the American Fisheries Society. AFS is the oldest and largest organization of fisheries professionals in the world. We work to improve the conservation and sustainability of fisheries resources and aquatic ecosystems by advancing fisheries and aquatic science and promoting the development of professionals. I've been in the field for fisheries for over 40 years with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission and with the state of Illinois. On behalf of AFS and our 7,500 members, thank you for the honor of testifying before you today in support of the Climate Adaptation Science Center Act. I also want to thank the full committee for their bipartisan markup last month with Recovering America's Wildlife Act. Connected here, and I'll talk about that later. Climate change is creating new and constantly evolving challenges for fish and wildlife across the nation. USGS National and Regional Climate Adaptation Science Centers, or CASCs as we now know them, address these challenges by partnering scientists with natural and cultural resource managers. The result is actionable science to help fish, wildlife, waters, lands, and people across the country meet the challenges of these changing conditions. Fishes are especially threatened by climate change. I'm surrounded by them on my wall here. Currently, 40% of freshwater fish species in North America are imperiled due to pollution, habitat loss, water withdrawals, invasive species, and many other impacts. Climate change is and will continue to compound these challenges in the future. The need for science to inform management will only grow as conditions change across the country. Therefore, continuing and expanding support for CASC is important and timely. During 2016 to 2018, AFS, working with the Human Dimensions Lab at Cornell University, co-led the first 5-year reviews of the regional CASCs. After organizing and co-leading each of these reviews, I can say without reservation that the CASCs are serving the needs of their partners. They're producing high-quality, actionable science, making climate science usable for on-the-ground resource managers. The external reviews made it strikingly clear that there is an extensive unmet demand among natural and cultural resource managers across the nation for these types of services. The need for science synthesis and support, data delivery, science communications, community engagement, and much more will only increase in the year ahead. I suggest that we really don't know what that appetite is because we haven't really tested it in a way that I think we can in the future. One brief example helps to illustrate how the CASCs work with the states in developing these plans. While preparing for the congressionally required state wildlife action plans revisions in 2015, the northeastern states from Maine to Virginia, including my home state of Pennsylvania, requested assistance from the Northeast CASC to compile and review data and adaptation strategies for use in these important documents. The Northeast CASC provided crucial support by synthesizing the most current science, offering technical support, and providing guidance that was essential to incorporate climate change to each state's plan. CASC involvement allowed the states to better understand climate change challenges like sea level rise, changing water temperatures, and species movement within a regional context. The result was targeted, coordinated conservation for species of greatest conservation need across the region. The Northeast CASC continues to provide important technical support for the states as they work towards the next revisions of their state plans, which will be due in 2025. It's important to note that these states would not have otherwise had access to this kind of applied, actionable science capacity without the Northeast CASC. Developing the next generation of scientists and resource managers is critical in addressing the complex and multidisciplinary challenges that climate change is and will continue to have on our fish and wildlife resources. The CASC play a critical role in developing our science workforce. For the past decade, CASC-affiliated universities have taught cutting-edge climate adaptation science, stakeholder engagement, and communication skills to hundreds of graduate students and postdoctoral fellows. Finally, successful collaborative science requires trust and mutual respect between scientists and managers. The CASC Act will provide the certainty necessary to develop and maintain enduring, productive relationships leading to more timely and actionable science. The science, data, and tools that the CASCs provide help to conserve and manage wildlife and their habitats while helping to maintain our cherished traditions like hunting and fishing. Respectfully, I encourage you to support and pass the Climate Adaptation Science Center Act, and thank you again for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Dr. Austin. The chair will now recognize Mr. Caldwell for 5 minutes of testimony. Welcome to the committee, Mr. Caldwell.
Thank you. Also, hello, Chairman Lowenthal, Ranking Member Stauber, Chair Grijalva, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Chris Caldwell. I'm an enrolled member of the Menominee Indian Tribe of Wisconsin. I currently serve as president of the College of Menominee Nation and previously as director of our Sustainable Development Institute at the college. I'm here to share testimony in support of the Climate Adaptation Science Center Act based on my decade of work with the Northeast CASC and now the newly formed Midwest CASC. Tribal nations in the United States come from diverse cultural and political backgrounds, with place-based relationships developed over hundreds and thousands of years. This connection to land is expressed through numerous and distinct languages, cultures, economies, and spiritual practices. My people, the Menominee Nation, are one example of indigenous peoples who still live upon our ancestral lands. We care for our forest and our forest cares for us. but the current disproportionate impacts of climate change felt by tribal nations require planning for adaptation to protect and advance our relationships with our environments, with the plants, the animals, and the natural phenomena we have known long before the United States existed. College of Menominee Nation, through the Sustainable Development Institute, has long collaborated with the Cask Network, including the Northeast Cask, to identify threats to tribal relationships, self-determination, and other ways of life, and to help develop adaptation and mitigation strategies relevant to each tribe's interest. The leveraging of Northeast Cask resources has allowed us to focus in several areas. We have convened 2 shifting season conferences, which were designed to bring tribal leaders, managers, and practitioners together with climate scientists for increased communication and to develop tribally relevant adaptation planning solutions. The more recent summit was held virtually in April 2021 with the theme Sharing Adaptation and Resilience Knowledge Across Indigenous Communities. We also partnered with tribal nations and communities on a regional assessment of adaptation planning needs. From this assessment, we collaborated with the Northeast Cask to develop resources and provide support, which included future-oriented scenario planning for tribes to address natural resource management and protection needs. In addition, we collaborated on a project led by the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission and other tribal and federal agencies partners to develop the Ginjagadig Anishinaabe Ezitwad, a tribal adaptation menu. This award-winning document provides a framework for bringing traditional and indigenous knowledge and perspectives to the forefront of climate adaptation planning. Through our work with the Northeast Cask, we were also selected to host one of the 8 regional tribal resilience liaisons funded by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. This position extends our capacity to help disseminate Cask resources to tribes in our regions. The design of the newly formed Midwest Cask is the latest iteration of strong and continued investment by the Cask Network in support of tribal adaptation planning needs. The addition of the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission and the College of Menominee Nation as consortium members allows for Indigenous voices to aid in conception and design of Cask resources at the regional rather than just project level. The Cask Network has become highly valuable to tribal nations as each regional Cask has developed in their response and support of tribal adaptation planning and implementation needs. More importantly, Cask development in valuing Indigenous approaches to adaptation planning needs is essential, not only for tribes, but broader society as well, because climate change is a global issue felt at national and local levels. Matt Chwaiwanen, big thank you for your work and consideration of this important bill.
Thank you, Mr. Caldwell, for your testimony. The chair now recognizes Mr. Cameron for 5 minutes of testimony. Welcome to the subcommittee, Mr. Cameron.
Good afternoon, Chair Grijalva, Chairman Lowenthal, Ranking Member Stauber, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Scott Cameron, Senior Advisor at Cornea Inc. Cornea is a technology company that provides scientifically based, actionable insights using advanced machine learning technology to support wildfire response, recovery, and mitigation. I am pleased today to testify before you on HR 6654. Having worked in or around the Department of the Interior for most of my career, including stints as Acting Assistant Secretary for Water and Science and Acting Assistant Secretary for Policy Management and Budget, and another stint as the OMB Program Examiner overseeing the USGS, I appreciate the constructive role that USGS can play on climate adaptation science. The topic of climate is very broad, as is the mission of USGS. Like most federal agencies, the USGS has its silos of excellence: energy and minerals, mapping, water resources, ecosystems, and natural hazards. The regional climate adaptation science centers can achieve integration across these USGS disciplines. To illustrate the need for this integration, I would like to point out some of the connections involving climate, wildfire, ecosystems, and water resources. For instance, Mr. Chairman, in your home state, the amount of snow that falls in California's Sierra Nevada mountains in the winter will affect the water supply of California's farms and cities in the summer. We've also seen an expanding wildfire season in California and the rest of the West. Milder winters enable insect pests to survive the winter and kill more trees, which in turn makes the Western forest more vulnerable to wildfire. Those wildfires put a lot of carbon dioxide into the air. In the Midwest, the invasive insect known as the emerald ash borer has killed hundreds of millions of trees nationwide, but especially in the cities and forests of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. If a changing climate gives the Great Lakes region an unusually warm and dry summer, then lightning strikes or careless humans may cause those dead standing trees to catch fire, threatening lives and property, and again, emitting tons of carbon dioxide into the air. Similarly, invasive plants like cheatgrass in Chair Grijalva's state have long been a cause of more severe and frequent rangeland fires, destroying the habitat of species that may already be or may become potentially protected under the Endangered Species Act, and setting yet more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. I urge the committee to give USGS more specific direction on the nature of the research that might be undertaken by the regional climate adaptation science centers to ensure that important connections are created across USGS's bureaucratic silos. The centers should specifically study the relationships among climate, wildfire, water, and invasive species, so land and water managers can manage more holistically. Left to their own devices, many research scientists will quite naturally explore what they consider to be interesting scientific research topics, but those topics may not address the pressing information needs of land and water managers. Section 6 of the bill provides for advisory committees and working groups, but it provides no direction regarding how projects are chosen after input is received from these entities. Further, the bill does not require standardized metrics for how projects are prioritized to ensure land management needs are met. I recommend that paragraph 62 be amended to include units of local government. They clearly have an interest in climate adaptation. And that paragraph 3 require the federal director of each regional center to annually disclose how the research program of that center aligns with the expressed information needs of the federal and land management agencies and state and local governments serving the region in question. Section 7 of the bill authorizes generous funding levels. Experience has shown that significant fraction of appropriated research funds may end up being diverted to cover overhead. The committee should ensure that the vast majority of the authorized funding actually produces useful research rather than being spent on overhead. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Cameron. That was very, very helpful. I think one of the issues that my colleagues from across the aisle have made is they'd like to see more direction, more out of the bill. No one disagrees, I think, on the importance of the bill. Sometimes the scope is questioned and how the money is being spent and where it's going. So I think these are very appropriate questions, and your testimony was very, very helpful in that regard. I would like to now recognize members for questions that they wish to ask. And I'm going to start after making that statement. It probably should be counted as part of my time, but I'm going to start with first some general questions. I'm going to start with Dr. McPherson. Talking a little bit more, Dr. McPherson, on why is climate adaptation so necessary? Because I'd like to, from your point of view, what happens if communities don't have the relevant scientific background to make adaptation decisions? What are the consequences if we don't have science adaptation centers and communities make decisions on their own?
Thank you very much, Chairman. One of the reasons why climate adaptation is so necessary is because climate change is happening now. We're seeing the effects on the ground. And even if we stopped all human emissions of greenhouse gases immediately, these main culprits for our warming atmosphere are long-lived. And so we're going to continue to experience climate change through our lifetimes and our children's lifetimes. And the only other choice to not doing adaptation is to see the suffering. And we've seen enough suffering with the storm systems, with the droughts, and these other intense events. And so our focus on climate adaptation is to help people live and live vicariously in a changed environment. We're trying to help not only the people, but the ecosystems that they rely on to become more resilient. And if those decision makers who are working in these areas don't have the relevant background, this is really where the casks step in and serve. We already know that resource-rich communities, for example, large cities, can already hire consultants. They can access funding for projects, but others can't. Others don't have the climate expertise within their organization, even necessarily to write grants to access funding. So the CAS can provide basic knowledge. We can link them to experts. We can provide them with climate projections and guide them how to use them. And we can work with them to develop processes for local engagement while keeping the big picture of climate change in mind.
Thank you, Dr. McPherson. Dr. Austin, I have a question following up on Dr. McPherson's question. I know that you were involved in the 5-year review of casks that was completed in 2018. Can you tell us more about the key takeaways from that review? What areas were the casks succeeding in, and what did they need to improve upon?
Yes, thank you for that question. We were involved in that review. It was a 3-year process where we did all 8 of the casks. These involved setting up independent panels of experts who went into these casks and spent several days on site, a lot of pre-work and post-work after that as well. All those documents are available on the GS website also for people to take a look at those. These were also early in the process. This was 5 years after the establishment of them. There's a couple of take-home points on this. One is that I think in general, and I said that in my statement earlier, that without reservation, I can say that we found the work of these casks to be highly relevant and actionable. I think we're impressed at that early stage of the development of this program that they were able to gather together professionals with the level of expertise that they did. I mean, it was really impressive to see the group of people that they had and the ability to attract students and others, because that's what it takes. It takes this group of people working collectively on these issues to deal with the challenges.
Can I ask you a question? Can you tell us what did they need to improve upon?
So I think the biggest issue then was capacity. They simply had huge swaths of territory. There's 8 of them at the time. That means each were working with 6 to 10 states each. And they were simply unable to reach out to many of the partners who needed some of that information. So the folks that were at the table were well taken care of, but there was many groups, tribal groups, other states, nonprofits and others that simply were not able to get the time and effort or the research dollars to do the work that they were hoping to get done.
Thank you. I want to follow up with Dr. McPherson on those areas in terms of capacity and weight that Dr. Austin has. How are the casks doing now?
Certainly, our partnerships have grown over the time. At the time of the review, we also worked in partnership with the 22 landscape conservation cooperatives
We
that
only have a
were,
minute left, so.
thank you, that were in
Go
existence.
on.
Those cooperatives no longer exist, and neither do their convening activities. And so actually we're in a little bit more difficult place of gathering information because of that.
Thank you. That was helpful. I'm going to yield back, and I now recognize the ranking member, Representative Stauber, for 5 minutes of questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. And in the spirit of cooperation, if you needed more time, I'd yield it to you if you'd like.
To me?
Yes.
Well, thank you. Thank you. So maybe I'll go back to Dr. McPherson. Is there anything that you think you'd like to say on areas of improvement that we have not, on where they are and what we need to do more as we're writing this legislation?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think our biggest challenge right now is the seamless transition of getting the priorities addressed at the local level, and that includes the transfer of money. There have been struggles with that in the past, even though you and Congress have been gracious enough to put specific language in for the administration to follow. More importantly, I think at this time is that federal human resources personnel are trying to reclassify the federal regional directors from positions of GS 15, which they are now, to GS 13. This is a time when we're under more pressure to do climate adaptation, and respectfully, climate hazards are expanding. The demand for our services is high. The regional directors need to speak to tribal chiefs, to governors, to business leaders. They need to serve on national panels. They need to work across national borders in some cases. This is not the role of the GS 13, which is where the human resources departments are trying to place these positions.
Thank you. Mr. Caldwell, I want to dig deeper into your experiences with the CASC's training and professional development. And maybe you can explain, you've talked about it, but you can kind of give us a little bit more insight about how the College of Menominee Nation has been involved in this aspect of CASC's work. Has it been successful? Were there problems with the professional development and the trainings part? You've spoken about it, but what can we learn more, if there is anything more that we can use?
Sure. Thank you for the question, Chairman. So for us, we are one of 37 tribal colleges and universities in the nation that serve distinctly tribal student populations. And I think one of the biggest benefits we saw with our engagement with the CASC network was the opportunity to connect our undergraduate student interns that would work with us with the fellows at these CASC institutions, like our partnership with University of Massachusetts Amherst, connecting them, providing mentoring opportunities for them to see not just necessarily the climate change context, but also that graduate level opportunity there. And I think that was a big part of getting our students from tribal communities seeing broader perspectives of how they can engage in the issues of climate change, but also bring that knowledge back to their communities to help. And so that was one opportunity, but often the CASC network had at the time focused at the graduate level. So we kind of had to create that relationship with our fellow consortium members at Amherst and other institutions Since then, with the new Midwest cask, that understanding's already in place with our partners at University of Minnesota. And how do we engage more directly with those undergraduate populations, but also the graduate levels? So I think that was our main focus. In terms of training, like I said, with our BIA Tribal Climate Resilience person, she has done a great job. She was stationed at Minnesota for the last few years, and we continue that partnership, but being able to then take cask resources, develop training, and provide it to the tribes in the region has been another aspect with the land managers in the tribal communities and helping them develop tools, resources, and planning opportunities.
Thank you. I'm going to now thank you for all of the panelists at this point. I'm not dismissing it. I'm just saying thank you. Now I'd like to call upon the chairman of the full committee and the driving force behind HR 6654, the Client Adaptation Science Center Act, Chairman Grijalva, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I think the follow-up questions that you had were caused me not to be redundant, so I appreciate that. But a general question on the issue, and let me just ask Dr. McPherson, if I may. In this discussion about the Adaptation Center, but it's underlining other discussions. There are more severe priorities, i.e., inflation, cost at the pump, energy independence, than adaptation centers in dealing with climate. India and China are doing a worse job in their air quality, while we have maintained a level and reduced part of that level. And so there should be a global trigger to doing anything about climate change until China and India catch up, make the commitment. And so we don't do anything until that global trigger is pulled. My question is, and you said it in part of your statement, we are rapidly trying to catch up and chasing this climate change that's going on, and the demand is increasing. And could you speak to why point of the trigger and why that is not a strategy? And the second one is the urgency of the work the centers are doing and the whole urgency around the issue of climate. If you wouldn't mind, Dr. McPherson.
Thank you, Chair Grijalva. I appreciate that. And, we talk about climate mitigation and climate adaptation as kind of two sides of dealing with climate change. In the mitigation realm, the other countries are talking, but not doing as much as the U.S. is to reduce these emissions, which means globally we are going to have to adapt to more changes and be prepared for more severe weather events, more severe droughts, and more severe wildfires, for example, which puts the onus on us to think about and to invest in these climate adaptation efforts at local levels where they make a difference. The benefit to cost ratio on adaptation has ranged from 2 to 1 to 10 to 1. So a dollar invested saves communities a substantial amount of local funds. And this is also a place where the public and private sectors can work together. Using climate adaptation as an economic engine within our country to focus on making more resilient communities is a smart way of doing business and will place us in a position that can keep us ahead of competitors such as China.
With that, again, my thanks to you and the ranking member, Mr. Chairman, for the hearing. Very much appreciated. And like I said, looking forward to working on the legislation as it moves forward, and appreciate all the input that we received today. And thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Chairman Grijalva. I think that we've completed all the questions now. I thank all the witnesses for their valuable
Mr.
testimony.
Chairman.
I thank
Mr. Chair,
yes.
out of, I just, I wasn't, I didn't think you'd take up all the time, so I do have, may I come in and-
Absolutely.
Yeah, I just want to take a couple of questions and.
Absolutely,
thank you,
ranking
Mr.
member.
and I'll
Fine.
be real quick.
No, as long as you need.
Thank you. Mr. Cameron, I want to thank you for joining us. And I've already mentioned HR 664 calls for an enormous 104-fold increase, leading to a net increase of $605 million over the next 5 years. Do you, or are there concerns about diverting resources from existing programs that serve state-level fish and wildlife programs?
Well, it's always a risk, Mr. Stauber. The appropriations subcommittees only have a certain amount of money that's allocated to them for a given appropriations bill.
Yeah.
So, all programs, compete at one level. I would point out that the cooperative, units in the U.S. Geological Survey that do a lot of biological research have a very low overhead rate. I think it's only 15%. So, one would want to make sure that the Congress knew what it was getting for the dollars that it invests in the casks.
And then the second question on the cask, the goal of the cask is obviously help the land managers make the decisions locally. However, if we see a 251% increase in monies put forward, is that going to, do you anticipate hiring more staff because the investment is higher? And if so, how many?
That might be a better question for Dr. Beer, but I think that would be quite likely to happen. And one thing that I think the committee ought to be very vigilant about is, where are those people hired? Are they hired at the national level at headquarters, or are they more boots on the ground at the regional centers, where they are more likely to be delivering value to state, local, and tribal governments?
So it'd be your recommendation that if there's hirees, we bring it down to the grassroots, the boots on the ground, rather than the overall overview from the national perspective. Would that be correct?
Yeah, the only exception on that, Congressman, would be you might be able to use shared services for things like HR and procurement at the national level, rather than duplicating that across all the tasks. But yeah, I think the default ought to be put the dollars on the ground in the regional centers rather than in headquarters.
Yeah, and then my last comment, I'll turn it back. I just want to make sure that the funding is for academic research, for land management, and just not academic research for just funding academic research. It's got to be valuable in helping the land managers make those local decisions. So I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ranking Member Stauber. I now call upon Representative Graves for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Dr. Mcpherson and Mr. Austin, I'd asked Dr. Beer earlier about maybe some examples, and I want to give you the same opportunity. Noting the extraordinary debt this nation has, could you give some examples as to why you would consider this a priority of the limited taxpayer funds we have available to us, and perhaps to communicate to taxpayers why you would view this as an investment that truly provides a return?
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question. And again, I appreciate your work in the past with the casks and with our early career professionals. So the work that's provided through the cask, as I mentioned, adaptation work has a 2-to-1 to 10-to-1 return on investment, making more resilient communities, universities, tribal nations, This is really important for not only their economic well-being, but also what we found is that historically, low-income communities and peoples of color have not recovered very quickly from weather and climate extremes. As you know well, there are still people recovering in Louisiana from Hurricane Katrina, much less the other hurricanes. And so building these stronger and more resilient communities can reduce those problems. Thank you.
So Congressman Gray, if I can build upon that, working at the state level and with groups like National Fish Habitat Partnerships, for example, they're putting things on the ground. Fishing in the United States is 50 million people go fishing every year. It's a $50 billion industry. You add marine, and it's about 170 billion. It's a huge industry impacted by climate change in all sorts of ways. But what we try to do when we're putting conservation on the ground is to do it most effectively. You can remove a dam here or put in a stream buffer there. But if you do it randomly, you're not going to get the impacts that you do if you're guided by good planning and tools. And for example, right now, I'm supposed to be on this Fish Habitat Board call. I asked them, what are they seeing from this? And the folks from Trout Unlimited said, here it is, Cask Network providing essential science that helps us improve our conservation planning. Their willingness to do translational science has been incredibly useful. Trout Unlimited in the work they do, just one of many groups working to use this sort of science. So it has a tremendous value in terms of us doing the right things in the right places.
I appreciate it. Thank you. You know, one of the, I think, Dr. McPherson, I heard you earlier make reference to the fact that we could cut all of our emissions today in the United States and we'd still continue to have this momentum built up in the atmosphere and continue to see changes, which makes adaptation or resiliency investments so critical. It really does bother me, though, that as I mentioned in the first panel, that we're, you know, despite what the United States is doing, we're still seeing a global increase, net increase in emissions, and other countries perhaps not fully participating in some of the emission strategies. And I don't mean to keep picking on China, but I guess I kind of do. Even under the Paris Accords, they're going to get to continue to increase their emissions by 50% between now and 2030, and it's just incredibly disappointing to see the U.S. progress offset by other countries and folks not taking this more seriously. But Mr. Caston, let me go to you. I know that you spent some time working at Department of Interior within the Budget and Management Office there, and I did hear you make reference to an overhead rate, which I want to state for the record, and I'm probably going to be wrong on this, but I think when I ran our state agency in Louisiana on coastal resilience, I think we got our overhead rate down to about 2%, but I'll put that aside for a minute. And just ask you if you, just based on your experience, have seen other opportunities for efficiency within the program.
Yeah, as a generalization, Congressman, at one point, when I looked at this about 5 or 6 years ago, the average overhead rate at USGS was around 37%. And USGS was charging its sister bureaus like Fish and Wildlife Service, BLM, about 27%, as I recall. So, you know, if the Congress is about to give USGS a very large increase in its authorization, I think you would want to know how much of that money was going to be going to overhead and how much was going to be going to the ground.
Yes, sir. I agree, and I think that's really important to make sure that this money is being invested wisely. And I know our chair and ranking members share those concerns as well. Well, look, I appreciate all of you, and Mr. Chairman, thank you for the time. I'll yield back.
But thank you, Representative Graves. And I want to again thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. I think this was a very good hearing in the sense that we really, I think, identified what some of the critical issues are hopefully as this bill moves forward. I want to mention to the members, that of the committee, you may have additional questions for the witnesses. and we're going to ask you to respond to the witnesses. We're going to ask you to respond to these in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members must submit their witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. Again, I want to thank all the witnesses and all the members. I thought it was a very helpful subcommittee meeting. But if there's no further business, without objections, this subcommittee stands adjourned. Thank you all.
Thank you, sir.